Fáil, and thank you for that contribution, Minister. However, it's not often Irish politics can still shock in its hypocrisy. We are so immune to the brass necks and the parties brazenly pretending to be one thing when the records show the opposite to be the case. And this bill actually takes the biscuit, I have to say. The party that ploughed the National Pension Reserve Fund into the banks now wants to protect people's pensions. The party that wrecked the economy wants to be responsible. It's simply not credible. I also don't think this is a serious bill. In all fairness, I genuinely don't think it's a serious bill, and it's simply not how we go about making laws. Let's think about what is being suggested here for a minute. We put in place a law to prevent another law being introduced. But of course, if the government decided tomorrow to bring in that law, they would simply repeal this law. It's simply not a serious bill, in fairness, Deputy O'D. In his first stage speech, Deputy O'D claimed this bill would provoke a constitutional referendum. And I've read this bill and see absolutely no evidence anywhere that it will cause any such referendum. And Fianna Fáil promised a constitutional referendum. So why does this bill not do that? I understand the Deputy sees this as a test bill, and if it passes, another piece of legislation will introduce the referendum. And in his contribution there, Deputy O'D said he brought this forward to ascertain the views of the House, and that could have simply been done by a phone call or a simple conversation. But this bill actually smacks of a cynical and meaningless move by Fianna Fáil, who made a promise they had simply no intentions whatsoever of keeping. Nevertheless, it has to be said, I understand why such a move should be considered. The pension levy, it has to be said, was a brutal piece of austerity. It was a clever piece of austerity at that. It took billions out of people's pockets. But because of the way it was done, it simply didn't register as the massive tax that it is, and indeed that it was. It is only in recent times that some workers have become aware that they are now being charged a levy to make up for the hole that the last government scooped out of their pension pot. And we know the figure stands at over 750,000 people now directly affected due to the pension levy. When we, as TDs, raise questions about this, the government simply wash their hands, and the Minister has done that time and time again, saying it is a matter for the trustees, as if it wasn't their doing in the first place. Sinn Féin opposed this levy, like we opposed all the austerity measures brought in by previous governments. And on its introduction, Minister Noonan stressed that this was a temporary measure. But now, years later, it is becoming apparent that for many workers, this levy will mean a permanent reduction in their pensions. When the levy was mooted, Sinn Féin called for extra safeguards to make sure this levy wasn't simply passed on to pensioners and indeed workers. Our proposals were rejected. And now, years later, the bitter fruit is ripening. In 2015, Pearse Doherty persuaded the Finance Committee to write to the Pensions Ombudsman, expressing the anger of many workers who were only then getting letters telling them their pensions will be cut for every year for the rest of their lives. And indeed, the Ombudsman didn't pull his punches when he said the imposition of the levy, albeit legal, though not necessarily fair. And at the time of the imposition of the levy, government spokesmen expressed the hope or even the expectation that employers could be requested or indeed required by trustees to make good the levy. This was never going to happen. Approximately 80% of funded defined benefit schemes were already in deficit, as measured by the minimum funding standard under the Pensions Act, and the majority of employers were experiencing financial difficulty in any event. even disregarding the deficits already accumulated in occupational pension schemes. Consequently, most trustees of defined benefit schemes had no option but to pay the levy from the assets of the scheme. So let's be honest here. It is not the pension funds that are to blame. It is the wrecking austerity agenda, the scorched earth economic policies of Fianna Gael. And just at one point, Deputy O'D mentioned the mandatory retirement bill, and I acknowledge that Deputy O'D had a bill that was due to be debated here in the chamber tonight. I think it was drawn from the lottery, and I acknowledge the fact that Deputy O'D pulled that bill to row in behind a bill that I've already brought forward. It's gone through second stage, it's gone to pre-committee scrutiny, and I'd ask the Minister now, we are now waiting on a money message from the Minister to allow that now move to full committee scrutiny. So there's thousands upon thousands of people out there reaching an age where they're going to be forced out of employment, not because of their inability to do the work, but because of an age on a piece of paper. And many of those people have not just the ability, but they want to remain and work. And all we are waiting on now, we have cross-party support, it appears, in this piece of legislation, an important piece of legislation, and I'd ask the Minister now to address that. We're waiting on a money message to allow that piece of legislation move to the next stage. And to conclude, my party is not opposed to the bill, but we are very, very aware that in all likelihood it is not intended to be something that is actually progressed in any serious way. It certainly does not belong in the Constitution.